Good morning, everyone. I'm Angela Davis, and this is NPR News. So glad to have you with us today. This hour, we're going to talk about family history, and not just the parts we like to brag about. I want to introduce you to a Minnesotan who is pulling back the curtains on the painful past to help people understand the impact. He spent years digging into his family history, and what he discovered has inspired not only a podcast, but also a book. Lee Hawkins is a journalist, a musician, and a special correspondent for America Public Media. He grew up in Maplewood, and his new podcast is called What Happened in Alabama. It comes out on Wednesday, May 15th, the first episode, and it is from APM Studios. Lee is also the author of the forthcoming book, Nobody's Slave: How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free. Lee is joining us from New York City today. Hi, Lee.
Hello, great to see you, Angela.
Yes, good morning. So, Lee, you have lots of exciting things going on right now, as we just heard, but I want to begin by going back a little bit to your teenage years here in Minnesota, if you can remember them. I mentioned you grew up in Maplewood, but what do you think made you want to become a journalist as a teenager or as a young man?
Wow. So when I was a kid, my grandfather read all kinds of newspapers. He was a railroad worker at Burlington Northern, and at night he was also a janitor at Montgomery Wards, and he was really into the Union. And so he followed the news, and he had me reading newspapers at a very young age. And my great-grandparents grew up in the Rondo area, and they were actually the landlords for Carl T. Rowan, who was a legendary journalist.
Yes.
And they had told me all about him. I didn't realize until later that he lived with them because he could not stay in the University of Minnesota dormitories at that period of time because Black people were not allowed to stay there. So, but they talked about Carl. They talked about Gordon Parks. They talked about all of the great writers and the creators that came out of Minnesota. And so that just made it clear that I could do it. And my grandfather, the other one, was the one who got me to actually start reading the Wall Street Journal at around 12 years old.
Oh,
and
that's
then I
wild.
ended up working there.
Yes. You worked there a very long time, Lee. You were a reporter at the Wall Street Journal for 19 years.
Yes.
And people, I think people should know that this is one of the most prestigious newspapers in the country. But then a few years ago, you left. So I want to know, like, what made you make such a change after nearly 20 years at the Wall Street Journal?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's the best financial newspaper in the world. So I was really blessed to be there as long as I was. But, about, I guess it was 2015. I left in 2021, and around 2015, I took a DNA test through Ancestry.com.
Uh-oh.
And I started getting into genealogy, and I started calling my father and sharing what I was finding. And then next thing I knew, I was spending about 3 years determining if there was a book here. And there ended up being a book there. I sold the book while I was at the Wall Street Journal. And the research for Nobody's Slave, took almost, 7 years. And so I planned this whole thing, and I was talking with American Public Media and many other companies before I actually left. So when we got the deal done, it was great. And by the way, American Public Media is nothing to snuff at. I mean, it's a wonderful organization, as you know, and the Wall Street Journal to American Public Media and Minnesota Public Radio, where I'm from, is just such a blessing.
It's a
because
dream.
they
You live
get
in the
the
dream,
product.
aren't you? Yeah.
You get the project, right? Because
Right.
it's right in my backyard.
So I want everybody to know a lot more about the new podcast you're working on. Again, the first episode comes out next Wednesday, May 15th. It's called What Happened in Alabama, because Alabama is where your family's originally from. And the stories you're exploring in this podcast, as well as in the forthcoming book, Lee, they're very, very personal, very intimate. You are telling all of the family business. And so I just need to know why the decision to do that?
I think the decision came from wanting to know my family's place in America, in the American story. When I watched the movie Roots, and I was a very young person at that time, just a kid, and I remember seeing, the saga of Kunta Kinte and all of the way that this family showed all of the resilience and the strength and all of that. And I wondered about my family's place in that story. I think it's important not only to tell the family business, but to tell the American family business and to get the story right, that the founding of America was about business, right? And the fact that my family worked as free labor and then under an apartheid system for another 100 years and still thrived. And the fact that my great-grandfather, Ike Pugh Sr., was murdered for basically daring to own land and to be an entrepreneur as a farmer, that's important because he was killed, and that was my grandmother's father. He was killed when she was 9 years old. And that murder was hidden from every generation, and over time, that 100 years, that murder affected our family. It affected the way that I was raised.
I'm going to pause you right there, Lee, because we have the opportunity to share the trailer for the podcast with our listening audience. So we're going to pause for a moment and listen to the trailer for what happened in Alabama.
Thank you. My name is Lee Hawkins. I've been a journalist for 25 years. I research, listen, and ask a lot of questions. My story begins in 1980s Minnesota, in the Twin Cities suburb of Maplewood. We were a Black family living in a predominantly white neighborhood.
Oh, Maplewood, it was really interesting.
It certainly was. My childhood was marked by so many things. Watching our backs on the walk home from school, getting our hair cut in the Black neighborhood, and church on Sundays.
All right. Who's on the Lord's side?
That's my dad, Leroy Hawkins Sr., singing in our church. He taught me how to sing. We played music together, and he really believed in me.
When you grew up, everything you touched was great.
From the time I was a little kid, it was always me and him, Lee Sr. and Lee Jr., Leroy and Lee. But while my dad was happy at church, nightmares interrupted his sleep sometimes. He'd wake up screaming, startling the whole house. It scared me so much as a kid. One morning, I got the courage to ask him what he was dreaming about. He just looked down at the floor and said, "Alabama, son, Alabama."
When I left Alabama, something came out of me, man, a big-ass relief. And I didn't even know where I was going, but it was a big-ass, just, man, like a breath of fresh air, man. And that's where I felt.
Born in 1948 in a small town in Alabama, he never talked about the place. But for my dad, Alabama was always present. In my mid-30s, I started having my own nightmares. I tried to ignore them, but couldn't. I had to find out why I was being haunted. Did it have anything to do with my dad? To answer the question, I went into journalist mode. I had deep conversations with my dad, family members, and even experts, all to understand what happened to him and to me.
I really haven't shared this shit with anybody, you know?
It's going to take a whole lot of truth-telling for folks to really understand. And I think it's time now because people are passing on. And if we don't document this history, it's going to be gone.
I may not have money in my pocket, but if I have that land, that is of value, that is money. My kids can fall back on this land, well, they'll have something.
I'm looking at the will of John Pugh. One woman, Judy, worth $200. One young man named Abram, $400. I mean, that's the proof of our line owning slaves.
Do you feel guilty about it?
No.
While I started to unravel questions for myself as a reporter, it's never just about me. This journey revealed a part of American history we haven't talked much about, the aftermath of Jim Crow.
That trauma, that collective trauma keeps happening over and over again. And every day that you live, you're running into something.
It's a history that shaped my and other families' experiences in America and how my parents raised me as a Black kid in my own country.
We were afraid for you that something would happen because things have happened.
Asking questions can lead to answers that lead to healing. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do.
There is so much strength and power in this history. If you look at history as a foundation, the foundations that were laid are still what have built our houses.
This is What Happened in Alabama, a new podcast from APM Studios. I get answers to some of the hardest questions of how things came to be for many Black Americans and the truth that must come before any reconciliation can happen. First episode drops May 15th.
Indeed, it does. That's the trailer for a new podcast from American Public Media called What Happened in Alabama. It is hosted by Lee Hawkins, a journalist who grew up in Maplewood. The first episode comes out on Wednesday, May 15th. Lee is joining us live from New York City this morning. Lee, I'm hearing the voices there of your sister, your mother. We heard your dad. How did your family, handle the news? I mean, did they have any reservations about you wanting to and choosing to share the good and the bad things that happened in your family?
I think so. I think initially my dad especially knew that he was unpacking very painful information. But overall, my family came around. Like so many people participated, including all my family members, my nuclear family members, and the older people. It was really the ancestors, people who are now ancestors who passed away after giving these interviews that pushed me along and said, it's important for you to do this. And mainly because of Ike Pugh Sr. and the fact that he was murdered 100 years ago. And on my birthday, as a matter of fact, by a white man who was never brought to justice. And now I'm a journalist and I have the power to tell that story.
So, Lee, so many parallels, so many families have, these family secrets, painful parts of the past that people just don't want to talk about. But it is important to get it out because that's part of the healing process, right?
I think it is for America, especially because I think we've been in denial that for all but 60 years of our existence in this country, white supremacy has been the law. And that's not a political statement. That is a fact that my father was born into Jim Crow, Alabama, and lived under a system of apartheid. And so the impact that has, having the empathy and the sensitivity to understand why previous generations did not want to talk about certain things they went through, and the fact that also there are millions of Black Americans in this country who lived through Jim Crow apartheid who are alive today. Any Black person who's over 60 years old who grew up in the South is a Jim Crow survivor. That's what I call them, survivors of American apartheid. And I think that's important. It's important to teach our children and to study the impact that it has had on families and the American family of all races.
Mm-hmm. It provides some understanding and why some relationships are the way they are today. Lee, I know you wanted to talk about something, the term integration generation. You told me that you consider yourself to be part of the integration generation. So what does that mean?
Yes, I'm really curious. I was very curious about going back and looking at the experience of Black people who grew up in Minnesota, especially in the suburbs. We were the first generation of kids after the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act to actually integrate schools and neighborhoods, and our parents integrated companies. And that experience, what was that experience like? I know that there are thousands of people of all races, people of color, who are listening and understand that challenge. Being from Minnesota, I know that it was not easy. We went through a lot of hate speech. We went through a lot of experiences, but still managed to thrive. And so I think that unpacking that experience and helping people understand how integration affects identity for people of color and how we have to navigate through, that's important. And I'll just say this last thing. St. Cloud, Minnesota, I spoke there as the MLK speaker this year, and I was just blown away by the diversity there. Mm-hmm. Because when I was a kid, we called it White Cloud. And now it's St. Cloud. It's changed, and it's really a superpower for them. I told the mayor, think about all of the different companies who would want to come and hire this employee base because there are so many people, the best and brightest from all over the world. And it was just beautiful to see. And I was very, very proud to see that in my home state, Minnesota. Rochester, too, I feel the same way.
I'm glad you still come back to Minnesota frequently. Lee, I mentioned you've done some reporting for NPR News, and I want to talk about a story that you did that was very impactful. A few years ago, you told the story of a substitute school teacher here who helped you feel less alone as a Black kid in a predominantly white school. His name was Mr. Bridgman. And I want to play a piece of a story that you did for NPR News and for American Public Media. You met with Mr. Bridgman for the first time after 40 years. And let's listen to some of that conversation.
It really strikes me that you grew up similar to me as one of the only Black kids. Mm-hmm. But a thing that stood out in our pre-interview call was that you talked about a time when you were walking home with one of your white friends, and he said, hey, did you know that white people and Black people don't get along? They're not supposed to like each other? Do you remember telling me that, and that you went home and talked to your father?
Well, he actually, I was in about the third grade, and I was walking home with one of my third grade friends. And he said, did you know that white people don't like Black people? I said, really? I said, why? They must have taken something from white people. Maybe they took their baseball or their marbles or something, because you don't dislike somebody for no reason. He said he didn't know why, but so I went home. I asked my father. My father said, well, it's true, but it's not something you should worry about. I think we could talk about it a little bit later. He was trying to save my childhood. He didn't want me to ruminate about something like that when I was only in the third grade. So he said, we'll talk about it later,
You know why that is so strong to me?
Why is that?
Because you then told me that your dad was from Mississippi.
It was. Right.
So that means your dad was a Jim Crow survivor.
Absolutely.
My father was a Jim Crow survivor. What year was he born?
Oh, wow. It was like 1898,
yes.
Something like that. My grandfather was a slave.
I would imagine so.
Right, he was a slave.
What do you know about him?
My grandfather was 15 years old when the Civil War broke out, I think, and he ran away from home and joined the Union Army. And when the Civil War was over, he was from Tennessee. He went down to Mississippi to find his sister who had been sold to Mississippi because she wouldn't work. They kept telling her, if you don't work, we're going to sell you. She wouldn't work, so they sold her. So he went looking for her, he found her.
And so with all of that history and all that knowledge in your father's head, I'm sure it pained him to have to tell you.
He kind of kept it on the down low until we got older, and then he said, yeah, you just have to kind of negotiate and try to, be calm and, try to stay out of trouble.
To hear that your father was the son of an enslaved person and that was able to see you graduate from law school and then to come in your own way and influence people like me, that's powerful. And that's how we keep the progress going, not only for our people, but for our nation. So thank you so much, brother.
You're very welcome.
That is journalist Lee Hawkins talking with one of his childhood teachers here in Minnesota for the first time after 40 years. Lee, what was it like talking to Mr. Bridgman after so long and then revisiting some of your childhood, your school memories?
Well, it was incredible. I was a third grade student at Weaver Elementary School. And on one day, this substitute teacher walks in and everybody thought he was my dad. And when I walked in the classroom, I saw why, because he was Black. And so having that Black teacher, that was a tough year for me. And having that Black teacher that one day had a profound influence on me because I felt alone. And I felt like, Mr. Bridgman and seeing his example really empowered me. And I never forgot his name. And so I ended up going back and finding, just navigating through the network in Minnesota and finding Mr. Bridgman and being able to speak with him and just to say thank you. You know, gratitude is a big part of my life. I try to express gratitude as much as possible, and that's what that interview was about. But what was really powerful was that how different our experiences were, because my parents felt that they didn't have the luxury to not tell me about racism because we were in that school district every day. And there was a lot of fear that my dad had left over from Alabama that made him fear for us and want us to be able to navigate through situations involving racism on our own.
And Lee, I know that you still, follow what's happening in education today here in Minnesota, across the nation. We still have a huge lack of teachers of color, particularly in Minnesota. We know that most students in Minnesota will graduate. Well, they'll go K through 12 without ever having a teacher of color. And so this is a good example of connecting, the past to the present, and why we should, look at some of these like disparities in some of these stories so that we can do better moving forward.
You hit on a great point. It significantly increases the likelihood that you'll graduate from college if you had a Black teacher. It is very important, not just for Black kids either.
And he was your substitute for one day?
For one day, and I never forgot him.
Mm. And so what was some of the feedback you got after that report aired and was shared? Did you hear back from folks?
I heard from a lot of people all over the state who were telling me thank you for doing that, because many of us go through our entire education without having a Black teacher, and especially a Black male teacher. I think they represent less than 2% of the teachers in America, and that's important. It's important for people to have a diverse base of educators so that they can, use that as a skill to be able to relate to a broad cross-section of people when they leave Minnesota and they go to college or wherever they go in their life. We need to really look at diversity as a superpower.
So, Lee, the first episode of the podcast, What Happened in Alabama, comes out on May 15th. I mentioned on May 22nd, you and I are going to be together at the History Center in downtown St. Paul for a North Star Journey Live discussion on May 22nd, open to the public. Please come and join us. Go to nprevents.org to register for that. But the History Center, there's also going to be an exhibit, like a pop-up exhibit with photos. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the exhibit shows pictures of my family to bring people through the journey from Jim Crow to Minnesota. And, we were part of what they call the Great Migration. My great-grandparents, Sam and Roberta Davis, lived in Rondo. My grandmother was very active. She worked for the YWCA. She would belong to They belonged to Pilgrim Baptist Church. And we're trying to show this one family's journey so that people understand, just to kind of demystify it and to understand the level of economic, social, and political collaboration that happened in that historic Rondo community. We can talk about the racism, but we also have to talk about the way that Black people proudly and in a dignified way responded to it, to work together to build this magnificent community. And then, of course, it was displaced by the highway. And then we found ways to buy homes from each other and do that. And so that's how my family ended up in Maplewood. So this exhibit tells that story.
Are you excited or are you nervous? I mean, I'm just imagining if I had to tell my family story in a museum with like a live audience, I'd be so nervous.
Well, I've been working on it for a long time, traced my family history 400 years. So, an opportunity to talk about it in the place that I love, and, this iconic, beautiful place with people that I love is just such a great opportunity, and I'm grateful